Great. Well, thank you everyone for being here. Um, my name is Maurice Pitesky. I'm a professor in the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine, Cooperative Extension, and I focus on poultry health and food safety epidemiology. I probably know some of you. To me, the most important thing about these type of interactions, Zoom or in person, hopefully someday, is that now we know each other. So when you email me with questions, or call with questions or text with questions, now you kind of have a face to go with, the question, and we can continue to interact. So obviously in this series, we're gonna go over some of the basics tonight. We're gonna go over breeds and housing, but obviously we're not gonna be able to in 15 minutes go over all the questions you're gonna have on breeds and housing. This is more just to spur some ideas, go over some basics, and then the additional questions you're inevitably going to have, we'll talk about either through our website or some of the other resources that we have that I'll show you in a minute. Before we get started, I really wanted to thank Rebecca and um, sorry, the rest of the UC Cooperative Extension team. So very much appreciated for all their help, Rebecca and Lori, for all their efforts here. As we all know, putting these things together takes some time and effort and coordination. So they did a really great job on doing that. So very, very much appreciated for all their help. This is part of a four-part 4-H Zoom workshop that we're going to be focusing on poultry husbandry. And tonight we're going to talk about breeds and housing. And then December 11th, as you can see, we're going to talk about buying versus incubating and hatching your own chicks. On February 17th, we're going to talk a little about nutrition. And then April 9th, we'll talk about disease, predators, and prevention. We'll be talking about a little of those things throughout each one of these workshops. So tonight we'll talk about a tiny bit of nutrition because I think that kind of ties into housing a little. So it all connects with each other, and I kind of look at things broadly and holistically. So sometimes it's a little hard to say, oh, all we're going to talk about is breeds and housing. So the first thing I'm going to go over just very briefly are just some of the resources we have, because I think we have a lot of good stuff that can be utilized. You guys we're all taxpayers, so you guys pay my salary. So I want to make sure you're aware of all the resources you have, including, calling and emailing and texting, all those good things. But we have some good stuff online. And then we're going to talk about choosing the right breed, some of the logic that you might be interested in. And housing chicks, we'll talk about, and then housing adult birds, and then any questions that you have, we'll answer at the end just because of the format. So I always put this slide at the beginning because I'm a pretty informal person. So whenever you have questions or deep thoughts or not so deep thoughts, feel free to at least put it in the chat box, and I'll try to keep track of that, or we can just wait till the end. Probably wait till the end just based on the format. But put it in the chat box if you want. We'll get to it at some point. Don't be shy. And like I said, you'll have additional questions, and that now we know each other, so that's a good thing. So just very briefly, so we do have a new app, Backyard Poultry Central. So believe it or not, there are no academic from university backyard poultry apps that I could find either on Android or iOS, which is the Apple Play Store. That's kind of a problem because sometimes, as we all know, some of the information that we find online is not always vetted and science-based. A lot of it's really, really good. People have a lot of, I think, really insights. But I'm hoping that people can start utilizing the app. We're actually working on an app for backyard owners that would be used in case of an emergency, like a fire. So the internet does not work, obviously, very well when we have fires and earthquakes and things like that. But apps, if we construct them correctly, you can have all these resources available to you on emergency locations, directions, places to drop off birds, go bags for your chickens, things like that. So feel free to download the app. It's only available right now on Android. It's not available on iOS or Apple. And then we have this series called The Sitch. So if you go onto YouTube and you just search The Sitch and Poultry or UC Davis Vet Med Poultry University, you can watch those videos on there. They're like these 3 to 5 minute videos that go over, all kinds of questions that backyard poultry enthusiasts typically have. And I try to put one out every 2 weeks or so. I'm slacking a little right now, but you can obviously follow us on YouTube and become one of the members. We're up to about 300 or so people that are on there, so it's pretty good. And we've had some of the videos watched several hundred times, which is a pretty good start. And then we've got this pamphlet that some of you might be familiar with. And you can find this on our website. It's about a 40 or 50-page book at this point. It's kind of a little bigger than a pamphlet. But it goes over just all the basics of backyard poultry. You can see my sophisticated humor in it. There's all kinds of trivia. I think it's great for 4-H. So feel free to download that, print it, share it, read it, kind of use that as kind of a template for how to raise poultry. So other resources, just really quickly, we have a newsletter that comes out quarterly, Poultry Ponderings. So I'm a big fan of alliteration. And you can just see some of the topics. Here's like a new coop that we designed with some really clever engineering students. We had virulent Newcastle disease. We had a huge outbreak in Southern California from 2018 to 2020. Most recently, we are in avian influenza season in California. So here you can see in the bottom right, those red kind of rectangles. That's a poultry farm in the Central Valley of California. And that yellow line that's kind of zigzagging all over the place, that is a goose or a duck, excuse me, not a goose, a duck that has basically a little cell phone attached to their back. And we can track that cell phone. And that becomes really important because I can now explain to farmers and to backyard enthusiasts this potential for disaster where these waterfowl, which are the primary reservoir of avian influenza, where they can spread disease to our birds that way. And that's why it's really, really, really important to make sure that our chickens, whether they're on a big farm or in a backyard, that they don't interact with waterfowl because they can get avian influenza, and avian influenza is a foreign animal disease, and that can cause a lot of mortality or death in our backyard chickens. So if you'd like, you can go onto our website and you can add yourself to our mailing list, and we'll send you these poultry ponderings as they come out quarterly. And then finally, one of the most common questions I get asked is I need a veterinarian, or I have a question about food safety or ectoparasites or whatever it be. So on our website, we have a link under resources for finding an expert. And you can see all the awesome resources that we have in the University of California system. So Alex Gary, for example, is at UC Riverside. Richard Blatchford and myself and Dr. Gallardo are at UC Davis. And like I said, we're all UC employees. You guys pay our salaries, so you should be able to reach out to us. And at the minimum, ask us questions. If you need a veterinarian and you're not close to Davis, we do have a link here that you can scroll down, and we have probably a good 20 or 30 counties in California where we have lists of small animal veterinarians that self-report as treating backyard poultry. So that's a real challenge, and we're trying to address that. We're trying to get more veterinarians to treat backyard poultry. So we have a list that gives you kind of who are some of the folks that might be helpful to you. So before we start talking about breeds, I think it's really appropriate, especially because this is 4-H, for everyone to know just a little history of the chicken. I'm a history nut. I love history. And I think it's really important that we kind of at least understand where chickens came from and their bond with humans, because it's not just this recent fad of backyard poultry that has been such a big thing. It's been the last, several thousand years. So the first question I have, and I know people can't really answer this because of the format, so I'm just asking it, and you guys can try to answer just amongst yourselves, just because we're recording this. But how many breeds of chicken are there today? So believe it or not, there's about 300 breeds of chicken right now. So that's pretty amazing. There's a lot of different breeds, and one of my least favorite questions is when I get people sending me all kinds of crazy pictures of their chickens asking me what breed it is. That's just not something I learned in veterinary school, and chickens are really complicated for me to breed. So there are some obvious ones, and we'll talk about a few of those in a couple minutes. The next question is, um, what did the modern chicken evolve from? So it evolved from this thing called the red jungle fowl. Red jungle fowl are still alive today in Southeast Asia. So you see them in Indonesia, you see them in parts of Burma or Myanmar, Vietnam, southern China, those parts of the world. And most geneticists and archaeologists and anthropologists believe that these red jungle fowl, in addition to the gray jungle fowl, are the basically wild animals that chickens basically evolved from. The domestic chickens evolved from. So when were chickens domesticated by humans? So this is kind of an interesting question. The first animal ever domesticated by humans was the dog, and that was in this period called the Paleolithic period, when humans were still hunter-gatherers, and dogs are great for helping us hunt meat. And then the dogs usually got a little meat on the side, so it was this kind of nice collaboration between humans and dogs. And chickens, depending on who you talk to, they were domesticated anywhere from 3 to 7, 8, 9,000 years ago. It's really hard for archaeologists to look at chicken and bird bones in general, because as most of us know, they're kind of hollow or pneumatic, so they don't preserve very well. And people argue that if you just found bones at an ancient site, you might say, well, that was just a wild animal. So people argue, like scientists love to do, about whether that was domesticated or wild at the time. And then last question, what purpose were chickens originally used for? So you and I, we think about chickens, we think about they're used for meat and eggs, right? Of course. But if you look back in history, chickens were kind of like squirrels. They just kind of coexisted with us. People didn't really pay very much attention to them. Um, and then, as some people would argue, as rice cultivation became really kind of a normal human activity, chickens started hanging out near rice fields because there were a lot of bugs. Humans saw the chickens, they saw the feathers, they're beautiful. They saw maybe the eggs. They said, "Oh, these eggs are interesting." But originally, they were kind of domesticated for religious purposes, for fighting purposes, game fowl. They were used for all kinds of interesting things that we'll talk about in a second, just very briefly. And the last question is, when did we first start having some birds of chicken, some breeds of chicken, excuse me, for meat, and some breeds of chicken for eggs? So anyone, if you go onto a farm, you'll see very specific delineation between layers and broilers, right? The broilers are these big kind of beefy chickens that we can grow to 5 or 6 pounds in about 50 days now. And the layers are these kind of smaller birds that don't have as large breasts, but are just these egg factories that just churn out eggs. That phenomena of having separate broilers and layers didn't happen until, within the last 100 years or so. So we take that for granted, but the reality is that if you think about chickens being domesticated for maybe 7, 8, 9,000 years, it's pretty amazing that up until the last 100 years, we didn't really have specific functions for these birds. So just a couple pictures. That is the red jungle fowl. You can find them on the internet, or you can go to Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and those countries I mentioned earlier. That is the gray jungle fowl. And notice their legs, like this shank here, which is our ankle basically. So how it's yellow here. So most chickens nowadays have yellow skin, especially around their legs. You can see all these ancient pictures, Romans, especially in Greeks, that they would draw the chickens with these yellow legs. Notice how the red jungle fowl doesn't have that. Most modern day chickens do have that yellow coloration there, and that's because of this one gene that basically proliferated in all of modern day chickens from interbreeding with these gray jungle fowl. So as humans moved westward and into northern Europe, their red jungle fowl slash chickens that they brought with them started interbreeding with these gray jungle fowl, and voila, you got these chickens with all of these kind of yellow from beta carotene metabolism, yellow kind of ankles. So this is just to show you some of the really interesting kind of functions of chickens. This is a Japanese rooster, a crowing rooster. If you go on the internet on YouTube and you type in Japanese crowing or singing rooster, they will crow for a good 30 seconds. It's pretty impressive. And the reason that they were bred for this is because when people first started exploring in the oceans, they put these Japanese roosters, excuse me, into the top of the ship on the mast area. I can't remember the word that they call that. And they would, if it was really cloudy outside, that's how the ships would communicate with each other. So you know the other ship was close by or further away. And finally, no, last two things. So this is from Roman times, and it's really interesting. The Romans used chickens as prognosticators of whether they were going to be successful or unsuccessful in a war. So apparently in the Punic Wars, the Romans at some point, one Roman general noticed that the chicken was not drinking any water, and that implied that they were about to lose the war or some battle or something like that. So they were very esteemed. We don't think of our chickens kind of as the top of the kind of hierarchy as far as our pets or our animals or having this kind of godlike abilities, but back then they did. And finally, this is something that I know as Westerners we're very uncomfortable with. I've seen this when I was in China for some work, and they showed it to me thinking that I would enjoy it. But bird fighting or game fowl is very, very common. Common in the U.S. too, even though it's illegal. But this was historically the original purpose of how chickens were domesticated. And just to show you kind of an interesting kind of a tidbit, the modern day broiler breeds, the Cornish cross. Cornish cross are basically, because fighting birds, they wanted to get them really big. So the Cornish cross was the perfect breed to select for as far as carcass weight and breast meat and things like that. So interesting history, and just wanted to kind of hopefully have people appreciate that. Hopefully I'm not boring you guys. So choosing the right breed. So beauty is only feather deep. So a lot of people choose their breed based on two things, I would imagine. Feathers and egg colors. And hopefully we can go over just a couple other things that you might want to think of. I get that these are meant as pets and they're entertaining, but I kind of wanted just to mention a few kind of tidbits about choosing a breed. So feathers, I get it. The Polish are just fun to look at. They are, I mean, just the coolest chickens ever. But obviously those are just the feathers. That Cornish cross that I just showed you, those are great broiler breeds. Most backyard enthusiasts, and it's changing a little, but most backyard enthusiasts are really more on the layer side. And the Rhode Island Red is kind of I would say the Toyota Camry of the backyard chicken world. It's solid, not a great egg producer, not a great meat producer, but they do great in that kind of backyard environment. They're tough, they're entertaining, and they produce a good solid amount of eggs. So I like Rhode Island Reds a lot, but I understand why people like Americanas and all these other breeds, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes. So just a couple basics. When you're choosing a breed, choose a breed that's right for your climate. That's a biggie. So I live in Davis. It gets really, really, really hot in the summer in Davis. It's brutal. When we do experiments with our chickens, I'm really cautious in the summertime. We've never had any problems, but man, it gets hot. So you just need to choose a breed that's right for your climate. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, what that means. Choose a breed that's the size you want. So bantams, if you're unfamiliar with that term, most of the chicken breeds have kind of a bantam equivalent, which is just a smaller version of that breed. Some don't, some do, but the bantams are smaller, so their eggs are smaller, but they're also smaller. They eat less, they take up less room. So when you're thinking about like, okay, I've got a small backyard, I'm gonna have to put a smaller coop in there, but I still want 5 chickens. I'm probably gonna get bantams then, right? So bantams could be kind of better in that scenario if that's what if space is a big issue. Choose a breed that's for the purpose you need. So layer hens versus meat birds. I know as backyard enthusiasts, we're not looking at, and we'll talk about this in our nutrition section, feed conversion ratio. We're not looking at how much corn and soy I have to feed them in order to get, a kilogram of eggs or meat out of them. But you don't want to, choose a Cornish cross and then expect that to be a good layer producer. It's probably not a good kind of scenario. Um, so at least have some knowledge of what you're trying to do and try to match that up. I would encourage people. Those layer breeds for once they are spent hens, once they're no longer productive, they do make very good stewing hens. So that is something just to be aware of. No matter what breed you choose, make sure they're vaccinated against Marek's disease. So Marek's disease is this virus that is ubiquitous in the environment where we have chickens. And we'll talk about this a little later on, but it's really important just to recognize that that Marek's disease is the #1 cause of mortality in backyard chickens, and it shouldn't be because we have a great vaccine against it. The commercial poultry folks use the Marek's vaccine on all of their birds. Backyarders, not very much, and that's for a couple reasons. Sometimes the hatcheries and feed stores don't vaccinate their birds. And if I talk to the hatchery or feed store, they'll be like, we don't care what you think because you're not buying our chicks, but they care what the consumer thinks. So I always think if the consumers start pushing back and they start saying, you got to buy chicks that are vaccinated, then I would imagine that they'll start working with hatcheries that are better, that vaccinate. And it's pennies on the dollar. It's very inexpensive, but it's really a consumer type of question more than it is a something that I can address, unfortunately. And we'll talk more about Merrick's a little today, a little in each of our talks, just because it's so important, it's so common, and it's so preventable. So I think it's an important topic to kind of talk a little about. Get your hatching eggs or chicks from a trustworthy hatchery feed store that practices good biosecurity. So it's really, really important if you are working with, or if you're getting chicks that are from Craigslist or from Backyard Chicken, backyardpoultry.com, and you don't really know that much about how they're raising the birds, that is a great way to introduce disease into your flock. So I'm a big fan of the National Poultry Improvement Program, NPIP. And if you get your chicks from a hatchery that is part of the NPIP, you at least know that someone from the state, the feds, or the industry has gone to those hatcheries, has done an inspection, has tested for various diseases, and has kind of vetted that hatchery. Now, not all hatcheries are part of MPIP, and there's some good reasons why that can be so, but it's good to be in the know. And again, as a consumer, if you ask your hatchery, if you ask your feed store, are these chicks from an MPIP approved hatchery? Eventually, they'll probably listen to consumers, right? So that's really, really, really important. Get a hen unless you really, really, really want a rooster. So there's some behavioral reasons you might want a rooster, but sometimes it's good to have a rooster to protect the rest of the flock. Sometimes the dynamics of having one rooster for your flock sometimes helps out with the social dynamics. But as we all know, roosters crow. Hens can crow too, but roosters crow more. And there's especially in urban areas, there are laws that are designed to not have roosters in those environments. That can be challenging. So if you get hatching eggs, you got a 50-50 shot. And I get a lot of emails and phone calls pretty consistently from people saying, hey, we've got a rooster. What do we do with it? And there are no simple solutions to that, unfortunately. Have enough birds to make up a flock. So you don't want a flock of one. Chickens are social animals. They need to be in a flock. 2 scares me because when disaster happens, then you're down to 1. So my own recommendation for folks is to have a flock of 3 or more. Um, so just a thought, and yeah, keep your setup simple. So focus on the basics, and we'll talk more about that a little later. But cleanliness is really good. Access to clean water and food and good ventilation. Easier said than done, but it's amazing that people, us being humans, we have a tendency. Me being at UC Davis and being kind of a nerdy scientist, we have a tendency to focus on all these other things, but not the basics. Clean water, for example. And if you don't have clean water, a bird's not going to drink as much. If they don't drink as much, they're not going to eat as much. If they don't eat as much, then they're not going to get eggs. So it's kind of that domino effect. It starts with the basics, and that's how you get a good biosecurity, good husbandry, all those good things. So, if you live in a hot environment, get chickens with a big comb and wattle. And the reason we do that is because chickens don't sweat, so they can have the wattles and the featherless areas are really good at kind of cooling off the birds themselves. There's a very rich blood supply in the wattle and the comb, so having a big wattle or comb is beneficial there. Um, in addition, if it was cold outside, if we were talking if we were in Alaska or something like that, we'd probably say don't get a chicken with a big wattle or comb, because that's where they can get kind of frostbite and things like that. Chickens are pretty hardy, especially like those Rhode Island Reds and some of the other backyard breeds, the Plymouths, the Sussex. They're pretty hardy. So they do very well in cold. They just won't be as productive, but they'll eat more and still produce that same egg a day, just because that's their biologic capacity. But they'll do fine. And in heat, the same thing. As long as you have decent ventilation, you've got cool water, they're not overweight. Those are all things that kind of lean in your favor. You'll see them open mouth breathing when it's really hot out, when it's 110 degrees. But if you have cool water there, if you have some misters, if they're not too stressed out, they've done fine. I've never, knock on wood, and all the time I've been at Davis, and we work with a lot of flocks in the summer. Our flocks on campus have never had, knock on wood, that heat kind of issue as far as any mortality associated with that. It can happen though, and that's why I say stay away from the meat breeds if you're in a really hot environment, because unless you have a real good temperature controlled kind of environment with good ventilation, and some kind of cooling, whether it's misters or whatever it be, that the meat breeds, they're big, and because they're big, they can't cool off as much. So just something to kind of think about. Um, and then the big most common choices, and I'm sure this is obviously not an exhaustive list. We talked about earlier the 300 chicken breeds that are floating out there. So I know people are going to ask me, what about this breed and this breed? And believe it or not, I'm not horribly knowledgeable on some of these kind of, I would call them almost like outlier breeds, for lack of a better word, because I work a lot with the commercial folks, and the commercial folks have some real basic breeds, right? They've got some of the genetics from some of these genetics companies, so W36s and those type of breeds on the on the layer end. So for the most part, I'm used to working with those breeds, and then some of these more interesting, beautiful breeds. I'm not as knowledgeable about some of their kind of interesting kind of quirks, for example. So one question I get asked a lot is, it okay to mix breeds? And the short answer is yes, it is okay. Now, in a perfect world, you want your chickens roughly the same size, because there is a pecking order, there is that social kind of hierarchy. And if you have a big bird and a small bird, that you're setting yourself up, doesn't happen all the time, but you're setting yourself up for challenges with respect to kind of pecking and almost like bullying behavior, kind of anthropomorphizing from a human experience. And when that happens, sometimes the smaller birds don't get the amount of water and feed they're supposed to get. You can have all kinds of fighting issues that go on. So that does happen. So my own recommendation for folks is, if you're going to get small chickens, I'd stick with small chickens. If you're going to get bigger chickens, stick with bigger chickens. It can be very challenging when you mix flocks, which is not ideal, but very common in the backyard world. So if I have 5 chickens and 2 of them die, and now I'm like, oh, I really liked when we had 5, and now I get 2 chickens from my neighbor, and I bring them in, or my friend. The issue is diseases. So whatever those 2 chickens, we don't know what those 2 chickens are bringing in. There's no real great ways to test them. The best thing you can do is take those 2 new chickens and quarantine them for a week to 10 days. Make sure they don't have diarrhea. Make sure they're not coughing and wheezing and gurgling and sniffling and all those type of things. And if they're not, then you could say, okay, let's go with introducing them to each other, and that has its own challenges. Um, so we talked about people choosing their breeds based on feathers. We also talk about people choosing their breeds based on egg color. So here's a great image I found online from what's called 5 Mary Farms. I'm like, what a brilliant way to display. I've seen pictures like this a lot where people have just this great kind of cornucopia of different egg colors and sizes, but what a brilliant idea just to have the font on there to say what they're actually coming from. So you can just see all this great variability. And I think most of us have been to like these beautiful farmers markets when you go to a table and you see, you know, that 12-pack of eggs with just different colors in them. And it's just so fascinating to look at. As we all know, no changes in nutrition. One's not healthier than the other. There's no, you know, magic elixir, mega fatty acid, et cetera, in one of them that's in the other one. But it certainly is like just amazing to look at. I mean, and I love this picture because it just gives you so much information, and it's aesthetically so beautiful. As most of us probably know, the good rule of thumb with respect to color, the color of that ear skin, and I should have put a picture there, but there's just like a little kind of spot on the side of their head where you won't see any feathers. That's their ear skin. That typically tells you the color of the hen's eggs. And here you can see, you know, some of the breeds that have red to light brown ear skin, and they produce this kind of brown egg. And here you can see if they have these red ear skin. Now we get this blue and green egg, so it's sometimes a little different, but you can see kind of some of the different breeds that will produce these amazing colored eggs. Those Welsumers I've never seen in person, but I've seen several pictures of them, and they're just these beautiful looking eggs. There are some farmers actually that will they'll take the yolk and they'll extract it using like a needle, and then they'll sell the shells. So there's a market for those that people will purchase. Oh, next slide. There we go. So where do we get chicks? We kind of talked about this a little, but just to make sure when you're purchasing your chicks, feed stores, mail orders, breeders, home hatching. Obviously, home hatching is not part of the MPIP, but then at least you know where it's coming from. So you can purchase fertilized eggs from some hatcheries. The only disadvantage of that, like we kind of mentioned, is you don't know if you're getting males or females, and if you have if you have rules against roosters, that can be a problem, obviously. Pick your chicks wisely. That's the biggie. So when you're at the feed store, a lot of people kind of ask me like, well, when I'm at the feed store, what should I do? And my own recommendation is if you go to the feed store, take a look at the feed store first. If they're just letting anyone kind of back there and they're not having any kind of biosecurity, they're not making you put gloves on or wash your hands or put booties on, that means that every single person that's choosing those chicks is kind of tracking in who knows what. So I'd be very skeptical of that type of choice. Some feed stores are really good about it. They understand it. They get it. Some feed stores are not, or they just don't put any energy into it. That National Poultry Improvement Plan is great. So you at least know when you're working with them that you're getting, you know, a certain bar of quality, biosecurity, husbandry, welfare, disease surveillance, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't guarantee 100% that your chickens nothing bad's going to ever happen to them, or that they're not going to be bringing diseases into your flock, but it's certainly a good thing to consider. The other thing is like when you're choosing a chick, Sometimes they're just all over there. So choose the chicks that don't have poop all over them. Choose the ones that are kind of bright, alert, and responsive. They're not circling. They look like they're they're thriving basically. And it's common sense, but just to kind of reiterate that. So when you're preparing for chicks, you want, and this makes 100% sense, a clean feed, water, and bedding. So I think we all know that intuitively. When you build a brooder, don't do this in your living room or your kitchen, because believe it or not, sometimes people do that. Chickens carry all kinds of different bacteria and viruses, including salmonella. So you can see this kind of circular ring, these brooder rings. This is made of the same kind of material that you build your, or not you build your, that you put on your dashboard when it's like 100 degrees outside and you're trying to keep your car cool. So you can get rolls of that stuff, and you don't want corners. So chicks, as cute as they are, they don't like corners because they sometimes get confused and they just get stuck in the corner. So if you have a round brooder, that prevents that, obviously. And then you have these brooder lamps. So these are heat lamps that also offer light. So make sure you turn the brooder bulb on ahead of time so you can keep everything nice and warm. And that you have a minimum of 6 hours of heat prior to placement. So you really want to get everything set up right before. The last thing you want to do is bring the chicks there and then turn the heat on. So you're putting them in a cold environment, and when you do that, that sometimes can cause, it's almost like a domino effect. They huddle. They're not good eaters and drinkers for a while, and that, believe it or not, just little small things like that can have a huge effect. Keep the heaters and waters kind of near the heat source. If it's so hot under the brooder bulb, then you kind of want the feeders and waters kind of across the spectrum of heat and cool. So just make sure that you're aware of, if it's really, really hot in there, you can always, in the way these brooders are set up, the way we set them up, and the way most farmers will set them up, those brooder bulbs can go up. So you can keep bringing them up a few inches at a time to keep the temperature in the brooder a little cooler. Or if it's really cold, you can drop the height of the brooder lamp. You can use a temperature gun, which is always fun to use. It's an infrared gun to kind of identify what the temperature is. And as far as the temperatures that you want, I'll show that on the next slide. But you want a spectrum of temperature. So I don't like it very hot, and my your spouse might like it very hot. So you can imagine chicks are just the same. So maybe these chicks over here in this bottom left corner, maybe they like it a little cooler. Maybe these three over here like it really hot. So you want to have that spectrum, that range of options, and you want to put feeders and waters within that range, within a few degrees of each other. And I'll show you that on the next slide. Never use a heating pad. Don't use anything electrical. Every single winter, there are stories, and some of them are really sad, stories about fires starting because they're trying to actually heat their birds, their barn for their birds in the middle of the night, one's wintertime in the Midwest or something like that. Chicks need supplementary heat. Once they have their feathers, they're able to thermoregulate, and they do not need any supplemental heat. Unless we're talking about some extreme weather issue, it is not necessary. And unfortunately, a lot of kind of disasters happen from there. So temperature. So really important things. So remember, basics of housing for chicks is clean water, clean food, chick feed, good ventilation, and the right temperature. So for the first week of life, you want a temperature between 90 and 95 Fahrenheit. And then from days 7 to 14, 85 to 90, 14 to 21, 80 to 85, and then 21 and beyond, 75 to 80. And then after about 4 weeks, they're usually ready to go into your regular coop. So just something to be aware of as far as temperature is really important. Those brooder lamps are basically what you're trying to do. You're trying to give them a nice, clean environment that's warm, where they can thrive and be exposed to all the things they need to be exposed to. We're not going to talk too much about lighting for the first 2 to 3 days. You usually want about 23 hours of light, kind of like a dim light, and then after that, we'll talk about lighting later. But just for those first few days, it's really important to give them light because at the beginning of their life, they're eating and drinking a lot, and they use birds, as we all know. Their main sense is their sight, so they need to see where those feeders are. They need to see where that water is. And one thing I do that a lot of farmers do that I really like is in the waters, I actually stick marbles in the waters because that creates like this shininess, and it does two things. It creates something shiny that the chicks want to go over to and drink water. The second thing it does is make sure it makes sure that they don't drown in the water, which can happen, unfortunately. Temperature gun or no temperature gun, if you have the birds that are huddling with each other and they're all around, kind of smushed around each other, then it is too cold. Okay, I don't care what the temperature gun says, it's too cold. Likewise, if all the birds are on the outside of your brooder, I don't care what the temperature gun says, it's too hot, right? That's the red circle is the heat source, is the heat source. So if they are getting as far away from it as possible, like I said, I don't care what the temperature gun says, turn the temperature down. So pay attention to behavior. Don't be a robot. Don't just look at the temperature number and say, oh, it's supposed to be fine. They're not paying attention. It's their fault. Pay attention to the actual behavior of the birds. That's your most important thing. Then pay attention to the numbers. Ventilation. So you never want, so just going back 2 slides, you never want, you want good ventilation. So these are rice hulls, which it's relatively easy to get in California. Rice hulls are a great substrate or basically material to have the birds raised on. It's absorbent, unlike straw. I do not like, the only thing I like straw for is in nest boxes, but straw is not absorbent, just like paper is not absorbent. So these rice hulls are great. If you don't use rice hulls, you're going to get a lot of ammonia. And if you have a high concentration of ammonia, it can cause corneal ulcers in the bird, in addition to being bad for their respiratory tract and our respiratory tract. Now, one of the ways you control ammonia is having good ventilation, but you never want good ventilation at the level of the birds. They don't like that. They don't thrive in that. You want ventilation above the level of the birds. And that way is how you get kind of recycling of the air and kind of cleaning up any ammonia smells that might be in there. If you smell ammonia, then it's way too strong. So prevent ammonia buildup by having good ventilation. Also prevent ammonia buildup by having some good litter, having those rice hulls or something else that's absorbent. Sawdust, for example, can also work, in addition to a couple other materials that I'm just kind of blanking on right now. Humidity. So this is one of those things that people kind of forget. So humidity is really important. There's some arguments on this a little, but in general, if you can have your humidity probably on the 50 to 60% range, and I keep going back and forth because I keep seeing different articles where people are focusing on this, but you want that humidity at the 50 to 60% level just for those first few weeks of life while they're in that brooder. You measure that with a hygrometer, which is pretty easy to get. And then you also want to make sure that the litter material, those rice hulls, are what we call friable. That's just a fancy way of saying that they don't aerosolize into a dust, and that I can't smush it up into like a ball and squeeze out any liquid. So in a perfect world, you want it to be friable where it kind of just breaks up into pieces, if that makes sense. So ventilation and humidity are really, really important. Bedding, we talked a little. Pine shavings, that's what I was trying to think of, not sawdust, pine shavings. So get rice hulls. Rice hulls are great. I love rice hulls. But if you can't find those, pine shavings are also really good. The hardwood shavings like oak, I do not recommend because those hardwood shavings have all kinds of oils that produce vapors that are not good for chickens, apparently. Don't use straw and paper for the reasons we just talked about. I'm a fan of not changing bedding too often. So this bedding in this brooder that we had for a flock a while ago. It was a good 4 inches. We didn't have to change it for 4 weeks. And the reason you don't want to change it is because every time you change it, you have the potential of kind of introducing new pathogens. The old bedding material, if it's not too wet, if it's that friable kind of consistency, there's a bunch of bacteria in there, but but those bacteria are kind of beneficial bacteria or just harmless bacteria. And every time you change the bedding, you have the potential for that to change that ecology. So in general, in a commercial operation, you wouldn't change the bedding for the lifetime of the flock. But the birds are kind of good at rototilling the poop into the bedding. So if you have good bedding, you shouldn't have to change it at all, and the birds will actually kind of compost it for you. When to stop brooding, we talked about this, but just when the outdoor temperature is within that, 75, kind of if you're a chicken, your perfect temperature is around 75 degrees. So once it gets above 75 and the birds have their feathers, you can certainly have them go outdoors. We've had birds go outdoors around 3 weeks. I think typically in that 4-week range, especially this time of year, is probably a good rule of thumb. We're going to talk about feed in another lecture, but since some people will be on for these, some people won't be on for these. In general, and in the commercial poultry industry, this is where their huge advantage comes in, is that they have multiple feeds, sometimes 5 or 6 different rations. And really what they're trying to do is they're trying to use as little protein as possible because protein's really expensive. In the backyard world, we have basically 2 feeds. We have a chick feed or a starter feed, and then we have a layer feed. That's about it. And the only disadvantage of that is just we're paying a little more because we have the very high protein concentration. You want to have that starter feed, and this is a mistake here. There should have been a 1 there. You want to have that starter feed for about 17 weeks, basically 7 days to 2 weeks before the birds go into lay. That's when you want to switch to a layer feed. We'll talk about that in nutrition, but I just wanted to broach that subject. I also want to mention there is 2 types of starter feed. There's the organic starter feed, which is unmedicated, and then there is the medicated starter feed, which is medicated, obviously. And that medicated starter feed has what we call a coccidiostat. And that coccidiostat is really, really, really important for controlling a protozoal parasite called coccidia. We don't have coccidia. So when people are saying, I don't want any antibiotics or anything like that, I understand that. I appreciate that. And I am, for the most part, in 100% agreement with that. However, this is a completely different class of bug that we don't even have in humans, coccidia. So my recommendation is if you want good, healthy chickens, have good husbandry practices, but also use medicated feed. You're not using an antibiotic. In my mind, it should be not even included in that antibiotic calculation that some people kind of throw out there when they're talking about how many antibiotics are used in food animals. I think it's a completely inappropriate kind of way to classify antibiotics in general. I understand why we want to keep track of antibiotics and why we don't want to use antibiotics in food animals, but this is just a separate subject. So we'll talk about that more in nutrition, but just wanted to talk about that. And then there's a bunch of different types of feeders. I am agnostic on feeders. I don't really care as long as you keep them clean and you prevent rodents and other things from getting in there. So reducing spillage is the big thing, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. I'm not going to talk too much about diseases because we're going to talk about that the last week, but I did want to point out that in backyard birds, the #1 cause of mortality is viruses, and the #1 virus is Marek's disease. So here you can see like the top diseases that are killing backyard chickens in California, and it's identical, roughly identical around the world. And Marek's disease is #1 by a ton, and it's preventable. So to me, every time I talk about diseases and people want to say, well, could you talk about, fatty liver syndrome, or could you talk about infectious bronchitis virus? And I'm like, okay, I could talk about that, but the reality is, the #1 thing that we're dealing with is the thing that's actually preventable. So I just want to reiterate that. And then coccidia is very common in young birds. So that medicated feed, the 2 things we can really do to help our chicks and adult birds to get them vaccinated against Marek's disease and to have them on that medicated feed. Not going to talk too much about Marek's disease, other than it's a virus that causes cancer in chickens and causes all kinds of different problems, and it's the #1 cause of backyard poultry mortality in California and most likely in the world. The vaccination, you can give it. You can get it at a feed store. It's really easy to give. We've got instructions on our website. The bottles are, I know people complain because the dosages, this is like 500 chickens that can be dosed on that. That being said, the bottle costs like $30 or something like that. So if you can get out of a vet for just $30 and protect your chickens against Marek's disease, that's a great deal. As we all know, vaccines are not 100% effective. So we just had a bird that died of Marek's in our flock that was vaccinated by a commercial producer in ovo. Those are these really injectors that happen while the embryo is still developing. So it does happen. There's hypervirulent strains of Marek's floating around. It's a topic we're all getting pretty knowledgeable about. But vaccines, including Marek's disease, work really well. There is no treatment for Marek's once they get it. And after day of age, there's no efficacy for the most part in vaccinating birds against Marek's disease. So it has to be done at day 1 of age or earlier. So coops now. So we're going to talk a little about husbandry. And I want to just talk a little, we're going to, just in the last few minutes, I want to talk just a little about some of the basics that you want to think about. And husbandry and biosecurity kind of interface with each other. And here's a picture of a coop I took a picture of probably like 7, 8, 9 years ago, and it's still the best backyard coop that I've ever worked with. This person was very, very fastidious, and I'm a big fan of the saying, "Don't make perfect the enemy of good." So we all do our own version of good. So good is better than bad. So you don't have to do this, but if you can make improvements and learn from this, hopefully that will help. So just a couple things. Trees. So trees are great for shade. They look pretty. They're good for the environment, all those good things. Just make sure you've got some space between the tree and your coop, because rodents, among other things, including raccoons, are really good at crawling up in trees and getting into a coop. Having roofing on your coop is really essential. So here you can see kind of a tarp on the top of kind of the run, and a real roof on the top of this coop area. Either is fine, but having some kind of top area is really important for preventing predators from getting in. So people are really good about having fences in kind of that, in things that are on the walls, basically, the surfaces that are perpendicular to the ground, but they're not so good always about having a top on there. So this person did a nice job on that. Make sure when you're building your coop that the materials you're using are easy to clean. So that's this point right up here on the top right there. And the reason I suggest that or recommend that is because you can't clean surfaces with water that are absorbent, because now all the bacteria that are in that wood, for example, that is not water resistant or waterproof, has bacteria and other parasites, for example, that can persist and or grow in that environment. So I like latex-based paints. So using latex-based paints in this kind of area around here, now you can pressure wash, now you can add soap, now you can add other disinfectants. All those things can be done now that you've painted using a latex-based paint on these surfaces. Signage is really important. I think that's communication. We kind of take that for granted, like, oh, no one's going to go in there, right? You never know until someone goes in there and they're like, I didn't know, and then that's a great way for disease to be introduced. So putting some kind of signage on there, official signage, is always a good thing. We talked about the waters and feeders that are easy to clean. The #1 reason that predators and mice and rodents and insects and bugs, which can all transmit diseases, the #1 reason they want to get in there is for the water and feed. In addition, if they're a predator to the chickens themselves. But the chickens, we can't address that problem because that's their home. But the waters and feeders, we can at least put the feeders away at night. So we're not creating a magnet for any kind of raccoons. And raccoons are just brutal. They will go in the coop, kill all the chickens, and only eat one, just for the fun of it, it seems like sometimes. Fencing, don't use chicken wire. I like hardware cloth a lot. Hardware cloth's really hard to work with. It will cut your skin up, so kids, be really careful when you're working with hardware cloth, and adults. I've got all the scars to prove it. Don't use chicken wire. Chicken wire is good for non-chicken stuff. I don't know what, but it's definitely not good at keeping predators out, keeping rodents out, all those type of things. So do not use that. Use hardware cloth, which I like the 1/4-inch hardware cloth. It's not perfect, but it is a really good heavy gauge kind of barrier. Have a separate pen. This is something that most people don't do, and I know it's a pain, but have a separate pen that you can have sick birds in, or you can quarantine new birds when they're coming in for those 10 days or so to make sure they don't have the sniffles and the gurgles and diarrhea and all those type of things. Here you can see a tin cat. So you need to have some way of measuring if you have rodents, or having rodent traps. So there are all different types of baits that you can put in these kind of tin cats. Having a cat around is a good thing too, because cats are really good at catching rodents. But having some rodent control, people that tell me, oh, we never have rodents, I'm like, well, how do you know that? And they're like, well, I just don't have them. I'm like, well, I promise you, you do have rodents. We all have rodents, especially when we have chickens. There are rodents there. And there's all kinds of ways to mitigate that. And that's really what we're trying to do. These tin cats, there are different types of rodenticides that you can put in there. Just make sure if you use a rodenticide, be really cautious, especially if you have dogs and other animals, because we don't want any downstream effects. Dogs, and I used to do small animal emergency work. Dogs love rodenticides, unfortunately, and that will, just like it's a poison for rats and mice, it's also a poison for dogs and cats. There are other rodenticides that have better environmental impacts, and there are some companies. The one company I'm most familiar with is a company called Motomco, Motomaco, I think, something like that, which is really good at offering those alternatives. It's okay, people that are really interested in composting and using that poultry manure, never take the poultry manure just raw and put it on your vegetables. I think we all intuitively know that. And there's all this carbon and nitrogen that you need to mix together. Straw is the carbon, the nitrogen is the bird poop. So if you're going to do that, that's great. I have all the respect in the world for you that you do that. Every time I try to compost stuff, I have banana peels that have looked like banana peels literally like a year later, so I'm doing something wrong. But the people that do that, I love that they do that. Just make sure it's off the ground, because if it's too low, you're going to get rodents that try to get in there. Foot baths, I said proper use of a foot bath, and the only reason I say proper use of a foot bath is a lot of people kind of have this foot bath and they kind of change it once a week, once a month. They run through it and they think they're fine. So if you're really going to use a foot bath, you got to be changing it every day, because the disinfectant that's in there, it doesn't work after organic material is introduced. It gets inactivated. So it's just really important to change it every day. And I like to have a foot bath with a scrub brush next to it and boots. So when I put my boots on, I can step into the foot bath, stand in there, and then scrub with the brush on the bottom surface, so I'm not dragging any organic material into the barn of wherever I'm going. And if I have a scrub brush there, it makes people slow down, because if you're working on a farm or you're consulting on a farm or something like that, sure, when I'm there, they will do a great job of scrubbing or standing in the foot bath. But when I'm not there, that's what I worry about. So that's my little trick on that. And then with that, I'll take any questions you have. I see there's a lot of chatting on. I'm not a good multitasker, so if there's some questions I can answer, I can certainly stay on. But hopefully that was helpful, and hoping that everyone can participate in our next one on December 11th. Thank you.